I'm Lizzie Abbey. Today I'm joined by my colleague Mark Jellicoe from the psychology team at the University of Law. And with Valentine's Day this week, we are going to be looking at the psychology behind the 5 love languages. So to start off, I'm going to throw a question over to you, Mark. The first question is, what do we understand by the idea of love languages?
So love languages is something that I think was developed by a relationships counsellor, and the relationship counsellor was based in the US, and that's probably important to understand. And the counsellor suggested that there were 5 love languages that can be used to support healthy relationships. So he would be using those in the context of a counselling paradigm, so where we were thinking about working with couples to develop and support their relationships. And we're thinking about things like tools that might be in our toolbox. So they might be things like using words of affirmation more, using the power of physical touch, things like giving gifts, acts of service, which might be about doing something for somebody else when we recognise that might be an important thing, or spending quality time with somebody. And I guess as we're heading towards something like Valentine's Day, these are all things that we might be thinking of. And I guess when we're thinking about relationships, we're really thinking, well, they all make sense to us, and who would really argue with those as being things that would support and nurture healthy relationships? So they all seem things that are quite rational if we think about the nature of relationships, the relationships that we're involved in. It also seems really rational and makes a lot of sense within the counselling dynamic that they might be ideas that a counsellor might want to promote in terms of the aims that the counsellor might have for the counselling relationship, but also the outcomes that are associated with that. But whilst those 5 love languages potentially seem quite simple, from a psychological perspective, we know that they make sense. There's probably, with any human behaviour, there's always often quite a lot more complexity that's involved with behaviour, and this behaviour that's within a relationship context, so close and intimate relationships. The use of those 5 love languages is probably something that is that, as I said, makes sense. We might think about things in a slightly more complex way as psychologists, so we might think about them slightly differently, and we often use theory to think about and explain some of those ideas. And we might think about those different theories from different perspectives. So the nature of relationships and how they've developed across time. So from something like an evolutionary perspective, we might think about what close and intimate relationships mean from an evolutionary perspective. So if we're seeking to promote the evolution of our species as humans, then engaging in these sorts of 5 love languages is probably important to our survival fundamentally. From a biological and cognitive perspective, so related to the evolutionary perspective, we can think about things that are really the role of neurotransmitters in sort of the process around love and intimate relationships. I know that's something that you're interested in, Lizzie. But we can also think about how do those biological and cognitive processes from the perspective of non-traditional relationships, if we think about the evolutionary argument for them, well, is there a different argument from the perspective of non-traditional relationships? And that brings us on to, we might also think about the power of these in terms of social processes. So what are the traditional understandings of relationships and how they have developed across time? What are the societal influences on those sorts of ideas that perhaps have generated some of these understandings that we're thinking about, those 5 love languages, which are about words of affirmation, physical touch, gift giving, acts of service and quality time, which we probably associate with things like Valentine's Day and those sorts of ideas that are housed within the idea of romantic love. But we might also think about things like cultural perspectives. So if we think about things from the nature of cultural perspectives, often things like the notions of romantic love, the kind of the dyadic, or the relationships that we often see between two people, do they work in a West? So they tend to be generated from the perspective of Western ideals. So we might think that the 5 love languages has been generated within a US context, but does that same understanding work from a different cultural perspective? So if we think about something from I don't know, from an African point of view, do these still apply? So we would think about some of the complexity of these, whilst we recognize that these 5 love languages might be really useful in terms of nurturing relationships. We might not all have the same experiences of them globally, and so they're some of the things that we'd seek to get beneath in terms of our understanding of relationships and how they work.
Wow, there's loads of points you brought in there, Mark. Really fascinating, and obviously the area that I was interested in that you mentioned is the biological aspect, and you mentioned sort of genetic fitness and survival of the fittest, which is of course very Darwin's concepts.
Absolutely.
So going from sort of way back in history to modern day, if you like, someone mentioned to me, I think it might have been you mentioned, I'm not sure who it was, but that this has been a big TikTok trend recently, and there's been like a lot of focus on it in the sort of in this very modern day world of TikTok and online love language quizzes. For you as a psychologist, and obviously knowing the background and the theory, how useful do you think sort of this is, or to the TikTok trends or these online love language quizzes?
Yeah, I think that the idea itself has a kind of a real resonance for people. And particularly as we get towards Valentine's Day, as I said, that it's probably, I mean, who can argue with these 5 ideas as being something that we would engage in if we're in a supportive, healthy relationship? Probably nobody. I think that, you know, the ideas of quizzes, and I investigated some of them in preparation for this discussion. And I think that as a psychologist who's interested in psychological measurements, or we might call that psychometrics, I'm not sure that the quizzes, beyond them being a little bit of fun that we might engage in, are that useful. What they tend to do is pose a series of scenarios that you might see in a relationship, and that might determine a favoured outcome. But the group of options that are selected, so what it tends to speak to is the idea that you tend to have one favoured love language. And the problem that I see with that, necessarily, apart from it being a bit of fun, which it might be, is it's probably not necessarily likely that we can separate one of those different ideas out from the other. So if we're engaging in an act of service, by doing something for somebody that they might enjoy, or might kind of take the pressure off them within our relationship. So that might be about, I don't know, doing the dishes on an evening where somebody's had a really busy day, and engaging in that sort of mechanism, or that sort of language of love, that's kind of the routine day-to-day things. That might be useful in one situation, but is it going to be always the thing that's useful? So will the person, if we understand, and as a couple we take that quiz, and my preference is for quality time and somebody else's is for physical touch, does it mean that quality time and physical touch is always going to be the answer? So I would argue that we can't necessarily. So whilst the quizzes are potentially a bit of fun, I think we need to really use potentially all of those love languages, but use those languages within a toolbox of behaviours that we engage in when we're trying to nurture relationships. Because, I mean, on a different day, we might have different needs and desires, and so keeping those 5 love languages in mind could be useful, but promoting the idea that we want to engage in just one as a preference all the time might be something that we might think is probably unrealistic. Also, as I said to you, one of the things that we investigate from a psychological point of view is whether the situation trumps kind of what's going on in our personhood. So, say for example, if we say that the idea of physical touch is something that we most favour, on a different day it might be something else, and that might be contextualized to the situation. So we need to pick from those different love languages from within our love language toolbox. I'd say that kind of just more generally, anything that encourages the idea of a more nurturing perspective within these within a relationship, to nurture the relationship. So the 5 love languages, for example, could be useful within that sort of context. But as a psychologist, I'm not necessarily sitting here and promoting their use, but because I think that there's probably more complexity to relationships that might be as a function of the situation that we get involved, the situations that we experience, our previous histories of relationships, say for example, and our attitudes of what love in relationships and the attitudes that we have towards it are. So I think the TikTok trend, probably it's kind of it's accessible, it resonates with people, but I think there's probably more to the science of close and intimate relationships than is discussed within those 5 love languages as a simple concept.
My next question would be that you've talked a little bit on theory there, but obviously when we're talking about things like love, Mark, there's sort of this distinction that gets made between the sort of pop psychology aspect and the sort of lay approach, which we call, and then the sort of theoretical approach, which you as a psychologist has obviously been trained at looking at the theory. And without getting too heavy, I was wondering, can you bring some of the theories behind this idea of love languages as a psychologist? So what is the actual theories that we are discussing?
So I think that there are many, and I'll probably just focus on 2 or 3. I think fundamentally, as human beings in general, we tend to have 3 basic psychological needs. One of the first and most important of these, we're social creatures, and it's suggested that we have a need to belong. And I guess within the context of close and intimate relationships, we have a need to belong potentially to some other person. So we can kind of belonging is a super important thing, but it might be expressed at a higher level for some people than it is for others. And so we can kind of think about within that, there's things like we tend to be attracted to people who are similar to us, and we can think about that old truism that kind of birds of a feather flock together. But is that necessarily true in close and intimate relationships? There's also that other phrase that opposites attract, and it might be that people who have different expressions of the need to belong might kind of be at opposite ends of those 2 spectrums. So we might think that that for some people, having a similarity could be really attractive, but also that having the idea that opposites attract, and perhaps an act of service, as is one of the love languages, is allowing a partner or creating the space for a partner to potentially go away and do something away from the confines of the relationship, perhaps if their need for belonging isn't necessarily as great as it might be for somebody else. And I think one of those ideas of love languages and using the tools flexibly, it's about recognizing, I guess, what our partner needs in that particular moment. So need for belonging is really important, but understanding how how somebody might express that within the confines of a relationship will be important, because we need to kind of spread our resources around, I guess, and feel like that we're being treated equitably within relationships. So that's another theoretical perspective that we really want to think of. So if we belong to this relationship, we want to think that both parties, in the case of really traditional relationships, are investing the same levels of resources in terms of time, the emotional involvement, perhaps like the financial resources, and are fully and truly being their real selves during a relationship. And if we're kind of showing that belonging within relationships, then the cost of potentially withdrawing from that relationship is greater, and therefore we probably don't want to do that. But if we're not investing, we don't feel like we belong in that relationship, then potentially that could cause issues, and it might be a problem for us. But I guess that if we draw it back to the 5 love languages point of view, if we're nurturing our relationships through words of affirmation and the other 5 tools, then potentially from a lay perspective, that could be a useful idea. I think that there's some other perspectives that we could also think about when we think about the nurturing aspect of relationships. So one of the things that we know, or we think we know as psychologists, is that our attachments to people, so it's kind of like belonging, is something that's really important. And attachment is something that has been explored by psychologists for quite some time now, and relates to our really early experiences of loving relationships by caregivers. And I think that's really an important idea to understand. So what attachment theory suggests is that where we are what's called securely attached, where we have loving and nurturing relationships, we have early positive relationships during early childhood, they say perhaps between the first 18 months, that really predicts how we engage with our relationships through the rest of our lives, both within our intimate and close relationships, but also in relation to things like education, work, and so on. So we've talked about the importance of attachment theory as an important role in the development of social and emotional learning as part of our childhood development. But what we know is that not everybody necessarily has those early nurturing environments. And so if we develop from less secure environments or attachments that are perhaps more ambivalent or perhaps more disordered, then that can potentially predict poorer outcomes in life and in terms of life chances. What we know is that people who don't experience positive or secure attachments in early childhood often tend to be people who have lower chances in things like education and within close and intimate relationships. But I think what I'm getting to with this point is that really, whilst that can be an outcome for people, is that we often see that people have poorer life chances. They don't engage in close and intimate relationships as much. What attachment theory research in terms of close and intimate relationships tell us, which is possibly relevant for this idea of 5 love languages, is that we can kind of redress the balance a little bit if we engage in positive close relationships with our partners. Say, for example, by kind of engaging in the sorts of behaviours that somebody with secure attachment might more readily engage in. So they might be the things that are associated with the 5 love languages, things like physical contact, giving quality time, acts of service, and those sorts of words of affirmation. So we can undo some of the poor, I guess, less secure or poorer attachment experiences. So I think what I'm saying here is that it might be that we want to we might want to choose really carefully from our love language toolbox, using some of those different tools that we have at our disposal in a context appropriate way. And I think, as I said earlier on, and I tried to refer to the idea that really we probably don't use one of those. So if we're spending quality time with our partner as a way to nurture our relationships, and we might be thinking more and more about that through mechanisms or tools in the calendar, like Valentine's Day, which could be a useful thought. It could be something that's usefully used by somebody to prompt a thought that we might want to spend more quality time with somebody. Then it might be about doing that alongside giving gifts, about using words of affirmation. But they might be things that we want to build into our everyday experiences within our relationships. I think that in a nutshell is some of the areas that I wanted to talk about. In terms of, I mean, you've talked in a short while ago, Lizzie, about some of the different evolutionary and biological perspectives that are associated with close relationships. So, from your point of view, are there any other ways in which we could use to understand the idea of love languages, or the ways in which we could explain love from a biological perspective?
Yeah, so obviously my background is biological psychology, and I'll probably take this perspective from the standpoint of what we call affective neuroscience. Now, what affective neuroscience is one of the newest branches of biological psychology, and it's really the study of sort of how genes interact with neurotransmitters and different brain areas to contribute to social and emotional behavior. And I'm absolutely fascinated with affective neuroscience, or sometimes called affective translational neuroscience. And when we're in this field of affective neuroscience, one thing that we can do is actually sort of look at the brain by using functional imaging methodologies. And this is a branch of psychology called cognitive neuroscience. What these studies show us in cognitive neuroscience is that we can actually sort of look at the brain regions that are active when people are in love, for example. And this shows us the biological perspective of what it means to be in love. And the studies have sort of revealed that there's quite a few regions that are obviously involved when we're doing any sort of function. But when we're thinking about specifically about being in love, we can look at little studies, or specific studies rather, that show brain regions such as, for example, the hippocampus. That's shown as being activated when people look at photos of people that they are in love with. And I could mention many regions of the brain, but I'm going to mention the ones that are mainly focused on, or one in particular is called the ventral tegmental area. And it's interesting that this area is seen as being activated when we're in love, or when we're sort of producing feelings of love in neuroimaging studies, because this is an area of the brain that's often linked with feelings of, for example, reward and feelings of pleasure or motivation. So it's quite easy to see how a region such as the ventral tegmental area would be involved in love, because it's the same region of the brain that's involved with feelings of pleasure, feelings of reward, feelings of motivation, and feelings of drive. So that's regions of the brain. But we can also look at the chemicals that are released in the body and the brain when we're in love. And those are sort of hormones and neurotransmitters. And there's one in particular that's garnered a lot of attention in the literature, and that's the hormone oxytocin. So you may have heard of it. It's often seen as the bonding hormone. In fact, it's often nicknamed the bonding hormone. And we know that it's been linked with maternal behaviour, for example, breastfeeding, but also other aspects of parental attachment. So many of the areas that you were talking about there, Mark, may well be linked to this neurotransmitter. It's also a hormone, works as them both, called oxytocin. We can look at studies that have looked at what it is that oxytocin actually does. And it appears to sort of facilitate that bonding. I mentioned there the bonding of maternal behaviour and parental attachment, but it's also involved in the bonding between partners. And there's been a series of studies that have looked at this role of oxytocin in actually heightening the bonds in relationships between people. I sort of hope that makes sense, Mark, but I was thinking perhaps that links into what you were talking about in your theories of attachment, and how physical proximity is important as well in the role of love.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that oxytocin is something that has been mentioned in the same breath as theories such as attachment theory. I'm not as au fait with some of the research from a biological point of view as you, Lizzie, but I think that there's very strong suggestions that oxytocin is something that has been used in experimental manipulations, as you've been talking about, but it is something that has been over the last 10 years been named something. I think it's the affiliative hormone, isn't it? And I think that kind of gives rise to the power of neurotransmitters and those different levels of explanations that we see in psychology. I think one of the things that also is kind of notable within the research around things like oxytocin is that it can be related to the role of kind of well-being and resilience. So I guess there might be a link there, but I mean, without looking at the evidence, it'd be very difficult for me to say. But there might be a link there between being in close and secure relationships, perhaps nurturing, as Lizzie's referred to, in terms of our expressions of love and how that manifests in terms of our well-being. So it's really interesting. And I guess that if we bring it back to the 5 love languages, I think that kind of using those and the way in which it was developed, so through through the practice of counselling psychology, that kind of engaging in those sorts of behaviours are probably never going to be harmful. What's interesting potentially is that we can relate it to some of the theories that and the explanations we'd be thinking about from a psychological perspective. And so it's been interesting to kind of investigate those and discuss them today.
Yes, Mark, it has been extremely interesting, and to see how these different theories underlying what we think love languages might be are sort of coming together from our different perspectives. Yours is a social psychologist, mine is a biological psychologist. So, yeah, really great talking to you. Thank you, Mark.
Okay, that's been interesting. Thanks, Lizzie.